Hey, how's it going, guys? It's Nate here. And you know how on this channel, I've previously uploaded a bunch of 5 mysteries you probably missed in Skyrim or Fallout videos? Where we'd dive into mysteries and theories from Bethesda games that were little known or otherwise more obscure than they should be, the type of stuff that other channels and creators missed. Or at least that's what we always aspired to do. Well, here's that same format of video, but instead for real-world history. Let's go. Starting off, Carthaginian Gorillas. Okay, so this one's a bit more cheeky and less consequential on the order of history, but still somewhat academically sound and definitely worth mentioning. So, in around 500 BC, a man now known to history as Hanno the Navigator embarked on an incredible journey. You see, Hanno was the king of Carthage, a large North African city-state located in modern-day Tunisia, famous for its impressive shipbuilders and vast maritime trade routes. Anyway, at some point early in his reign, when he had some free time, Hanno decided that he wanted to explore what lay beyond the Mediterranean Sea. He wanted to go beyond the Straits of Gibraltar, or Pillars of Hercules as he called them, and see what was out there. So, he commissioned a fleet of around 60 of the finest ships money could buy, and several thousand sailors, soldiers, and settlers, and set off into the vast unknown. Ultimately, Hanno's journey would take him around the West African coast, seemingly as far south as modern-day Mount Cameroon, perhaps a lot further depending on who you believe, until his return. Hanno published a series of accounts from his adventure, which haven't survived in full, but parts of them were preserved by later Roman and Greek authors, who regularly referenced this odyssey. One such tale that has survived, and my favorite of all, is that evidently, when Hanno's fleet was docked somewhere off the modern-day coast of Ghana, Hanno and his men encountered an island populated by a hairy and extremely aggressive people, which the Carthaginian voyagers called Gorillae, citing their interpreters. Hanno's forces attempted to capture some of these Gorillae and bring them back to Carthage for study, but several of his men were wounded in their attempts, and the Gorillae proved impossible to subdue peacefully. So they opted to just kill them and bring their skins back to Carthage. Quote, "In its inmost recess was an island, similar to that formerly described, which contained in like manner a lake, with another island, inhabited by a rude description of people. The females were much more numerous than the males, and had hairy, rough skins. Our interpreters called them Gorillae. We pursued, but could take none of the males. They had all escaped to the tops of the mountains and precipices, which they mounted with ease, and threw down stones. We took 3 of the females, but they made such violent struggles, biting and tearing at their captors, that we had to kill them, and stripped off their skins, which we carried back to Carthage. Being out of provisions, we could go no further anyway." End quote. Alas, the term Gorillae seems to have stuck in the Phoenician and later Greek languages, lending itself to denote hairy, wild, bipedal creatures from the African jungles, and eventually becoming attached to our modern understanding of the biological genus gorilla, denoting the largest of the great apes. What's less clear, and the real mystery here, is what exactly were the Gorillae Hanno and his men ran into? It's hilarious to imagine these ancient Phoenician sailors mistaking giant silverback gorillas for hairy men and trying to reason and negotiate with them, thinking they're just some primitive tribe. Interestingly enough, gorillas and other great apes have been observed throwing stones in the wild, and it would make sense for there to be more females in the group encountered, seeing as gorillas and other species of great ape often move in groups consisting of large females led by a single young silverback male. At the same time, primitive polygamous human societies often had the same disproportionate female-to-male ratio in their own groups, so that description cuts both ways. Whatever Hanno found, be it a species of monkey or man, or maybe some lost archaic hominid thing, this tale is one of the funnier mysteries recorded in the ancient pre-Roman record. But before we move on, quick word from today's video sponsor. This video is being brought to you by Factor. Warmer, sunnier days are coming. Fuel them with Factor's high quality, no mess, no prep meals delivered straight to your door. Factor helps you avoid the mess and time of cooking at home and the expenses of ordering in, with delicious and nutritious, no-nonsense food that's ready quickly. Factor's chef-prepared meals make it easy to eat well, so you never have to opt for something that isn't good for you. As someone who all too often doesn't allocate enough time in a day, or week, for a trip to the grocery, let alone enough time to clean the whole kitchen, Factor has been a huge saving grace to my schedule. Head to factor75.com or click the link down below and use code EPICNATE50 to get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off your next month of orders. That's code EPICNATE50 at factor75.com to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month of orders. Now, back to our regularly scheduled programming. Next on our list, Columbus New refers to the idea that Christopher Columbus's discovery of the New World may not have been quite as accidental as we were all taught in grade school. So, the story that we're all generally familiar with is that Christopher Columbus was some Genoese guy who liked to sail or something, and developed this wacky idea that the lands of Asia, specifically the kingdoms of China and Japan, or Cathay and Chipangu, could be reached by sailing west across the Atlantic. He took this proposal to the sovereigns Ferdinand and Isabella of a newly united Spain, and the monarchs reluctantly agreed to furnish his expedition with men, ships, and monies. While Columbus radically miscalculated the size of the world and failed to find an alternative route to Asia, by sheer coincidence he just happened to land in what is now the New World, and despite his enormous mistake, irrevocably changed the tide of human history. Alas, some have made the argument, including some of the Spanish court's own historians and Columbus's own captains, that the Genoese navigator wasn't mistaken in his calculations at all, and actually knew exactly what he was doing. Or, more modestly, was at least aware of the possibility that his destination would take him to an unknown land. This theory primarily rests on Columbus's own impressive career prior to the expedition. You see, Christopher wasn't just some guy who liked sailing. You don't get an audience with the King and Queen of Spain by being just some guy. No, by 1492, he had made a name for himself as one of the most talented navigators in Western Europe, and had developed a particular familiarity with the Eastern Atlantic during his lifetime. After over a decade of service in the Genoese Navy, sailing from the Aegean to the British Isles and perhaps to Iceland, that part's a little disputed, he entered the service of Portuguese merchant families in the mid-1470s, leading him to spend another decade captaining ships and convoys around Western Africa, and going as far south as modern-day Senegal. He evidently made such an impression on his Portuguese patrons that the governor of Madeira, one of the outermost Atlantic islands under the control of Portugal, allowed Columbus to marry his daughter. During this episode of his life, it's very possible, perhaps even likely, that the captain would have heard rumors about lands to the west going around Portuguese nautical circles. Specifically, a fabled landmass known as Antillia. You see, sailing around West Africa requires swinging far to the west in order to catch the prevailing winds and avoid the rocky, rather dangerous and slow coastal waters. Portuguese and Spanish sailors who embarked on this path, and perhaps gotten blown a bit too far off course, may very well have spotted the Brazilian coast well before 1492. Moreover, sightings of migratory birds headed west would have been commonplace, and rumors of these sightings would have been prevalent in maritime circles. Indeed, several Portuguese maps, dating as far back as 1424, show mysterious, unexplored land masses to the west of Spain and Africa. Oftentimes, these land masses are marked down by cartographers as Antilia, and this island is usually depicted as a long rectangle, the shape used to depict an unexplored landmass on a cartography chart. The Portuguese knew something mysterious was out there. Furthermore, in 1487, more than 5 years prior to the launch of Columbus's expedition, Portuguese sailor João Afonso do Estreito and Fernando Dolmo convinced Portugal's King John II to furnish an expedition to the edges of the Atlantic, with the explicit goal of finding this lost land of Antilia. Alas, shortly after being granted their royal charter, Do Estreito and Dolmo simply vanish from history and are never heard from again. Most scholars believe that they were lost at sea, but their name is so absent from the records afterwards that some do question whether their voyage ever managed to take off at all. Regardless, the point is that rumors of lost lands to the west were prevalent among the Portuguese maritime community, and were considered credible enough that the king was willing to risk significant financial and reputational damage in order to investigate them. Columbus, being a high-ranking man, a high-ranking captain in the Portuguese Navy, almost certainly would have been privy to these tales. Hey guys, Nate from the future here. So, quick update. I did some more research on João do Estreito and Fernando Dolmo, and it turns out they actually seem to have been very wealthy people in their own right. They were both knights. Dolmo was a Flemish knight of some kind, and João do Estreito, interestingly enough, seems to have been some kind of merchant involved in the West African spice trade, who lived on the island of Madeira at the same time as Columbus did around 1488, which I find interesting. But when they approached King John II, they actually didn't request very much money or ships or crews. They offered to self-finance the journey, and what they asked for, really, was the royal assent to become governors of the island once they found it. So they said, hey, King John, we think there's this lost island called Antilia to the far west, we know you've heard of it, we're gonna go try and find it on our own. All we need from you is the right to govern it if we find it. So we can set up courts, collect taxes, oversee resettling stuff, that sort of thing. And when we die, we want our sons to inherit that right as well, and their sons, so on and so forth. Later on in the video, we'll talk about how these demands are actually very similar to some of the ones Columbus made, and it just seems incredibly likely that Do Estreito and Columbus may have crossed paths at some time, both being so involved in the Portuguese West African spice trade in Madeira. But anyway, digress, just wanted to throw that out there. But now, let's return to the rest of the video. Moreover, this idea that Columbus wasn't trying to get to Asia at all, but was really in search of a new lost land, was actually widely accepted throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. As a matter of fact, it was even the position of one of the Spanish court's royal historians in the early 1500s. You see, shortly after Columbus's discovery of the New World, in the opening decade of the 1500s, the Spanish sent this guy, named Gonzalo Fernández de Ovidio y Valdez, to the island of Hispaniola to supervise some gold mining and smelting operations. Gonzalo worked on Hispaniola for at least a decade, perhaps 2, and after returning to Spain, was commissioned by the royal court to essentially write a book about the island and the broader Caribbean. In this work that he ended up producing, titled Sumario de la Natural Historia de las Indias, or Summary of the Natural History of the Indies, Gonzalo asserts his belief that Columbus knew exactly what he was doing, and never had any intention of going to Asia in the first place. Quote, "Some say that the Indies were first known many centuries ago, and that their situation was written down and the exact latitudes noted in which they lay, but their geography and sea routes forgotten, and that Christopher Columbus, a learned man, well read in the science of cosmology, set out to make a fresh discovery of these islands. I am inclined to believe this theory. Captain Ovidio later tells the tale of English merchants who were blown off course sometime in the 1480s, and landed in a mysterious land populated by primitive tribes where they had to remain until the prevailing winds allowed them to return. Ovidio claims Columbus personally received a survivor of this failed expedition. Quote, "There is a story that a caravel sailing from Spain to England with a cargo of merchandise and provisions, wines, and other goods not to be found in England and generally sent there from Spain, was overwhelmed by such violent contrary winds that it was forced to run west for many days, in the course of which it sighted one or more of the Indies. A landing was made on one of these islands, and naked people were seen like those found here today. When the winds which had brought them here against their will died down, they took aboard water and wood and sailed back on to their previous course." The story goes on to say that as the greater part of the ship's cargo consisted of food and wine, the crew had sufficient supplies to keep them alive on this long and arduous voyage, and to make the return passage, meeting with favorable weather. They reached Europe safely, and made for Portugal. The voyage had been extremely long and dangerous, and they had all been greatly afraid. Moreover, though the winds had driven them swiftly on their course, the journey there and back lasted for 4 or 5 months, possibly even more. In the course of that time, all of the ship's crew died. The only men to land back in Portugal were the pilot and 3 or 4 sailors, and all these were so ill that they also died a short time after their arrival. The story goes that this pilot was a close friend of Christopher Columbus and had some knowledge of the quadrant, and that he marked the position of this land he had discovered. He is said to have given this information privately to Columbus, asking him to make a map and place upon it this land which he had seen. Columbus is said to have welcomed him into his house as a friend and gotten him medical treatment, for by now he was very sick. Nevertheless, he died like the others. Thus Columbus remained with sole knowledge of these islands, and this he kept to himself." End quote. Now, mind you, Captain Gonzalo Fernandez de Ovidio, God, I love saying that name, is not just some random guy. He was literally sent to Santo Domingo in one of the earliest Spanish expeditions back to the New World after Columbus's journey there. He supervised extensive mining operations, and when he returned, the Spanish government said, "Hey, why don't you write us a big history of the Indies?" And this is what he wrote for the official Spanish court. So, indeed, even the preeminent contemporary historians of this day, and the Spanish government itself, in a way, seems to have believed that Columbus had intended to discover or rediscover these lost lands all along. But why then wouldn't he have just said that to the Spanish monarchs? Why all this obfuscating about a sea route to Japan and China? Why not just tell Ferdinand and Isabella, "Hey, there's an island there, I want to find it"? Well, part of the reason may have been fears that if he openly advertised his real plan, someone else would have beaten him to it, or the various European monarchs would have just hired someone else to do it for less money, by instead manifesting this completely insane proposal that the Earth was supposedly smaller than everybody already knew it was, and that he could make it to Japan in what coincidentally turned out to be the same amount of time it took for him to get to the Caribbean. He ran less of a risk of being copied or undercut. Furthermore, part of Columbus's demands for compensation were that he would be given perpetual governorship of any lands found between Spain and Asia, and that this perpetual governorship would remain in his family to be passed down to his future male descendants. What luck that he just happened to discover an entire new hemisphere in between Spain and Asia, and now, hey, what do you know, technically that all belonged to Columbus. Now, of course, despite the Spanish government initially actually honoring this agreement and giving Columbus governorship of the early colonies, he proved to be a far less able administrator than he was captain, and the Spanish government would end up not honoring that whole part of the bargain, which would become the subject of a legal battle that continued for the next 200 years between his descendants and the crown, but you get the idea. The Portuguese were well aware of unexplored islands far to the west. Columbus himself was among the most accomplished men to have served the Portuguese crown, and contemporary historians, endorsed by the Spanish court, assert that he knew what he was doing. I personally wonder if maybe it was a bit of both. Perhaps Columbus really did expect to find a western route to Asia, but was also aware of the possibility that he'd run into something else. Coming in at number 3, Lost Amazonian Cities is exactly what it sounds like. The idea that the Amazon rainforest, the largest rainforest in the world, was once home to several ancient pre-Columbian cities and civilizations that have since been lost to time and consumed by the jungle. In the 1500s, a Spanish conquistador by the name of Francisco Orellana, somewhat accidentally, ended up leading a small expedition of Spanish troops and native, allies, I use that term loosely, across the entire width of the Amazon rainforest, from Peru to Trinidad, mostly by navigating the forest's river system, but also with a whole lot of hiking. During this frankly Homeric journey, Orellana and his men reported encountering several enormous, grand urban cities in the jungle, with populations and organization structures that rivaled Madrid itself back in Spain. They further reported an enormous density of villages and hamlets at almost every turn, and imposing kingdoms of vast wealth. Gaspar de Carvajal, a missionary who was attached to Orellana's expedition, would later publish a detailed account of their experience, which added fuel to the fiery rumors of El Dorado and great cities of gold in the New World. Over the ensuing decades, similar reports would be made by small numbers of conquistadors sent to the region, but they would quickly fade, and no definitive locations of these alleged cities and civilizations was ever conclusively identified. By the 1700s, most scholars and academics began dismissing these stories outright, as mere fantasies propagated by men desperate to glorify themselves, with little basis in reality. For a while, it was thought that Amazonian soil was just too acidic and nutrient-sparse to sustain the amount of agriculture that would be necessary to support these alleged societies, and that the Amazon could only be home to sparsely populated groups of small, primitive nomadic tribes like those we see today. However, over the last couple of decades, the archaeological consensus at first gradually, then very suddenly, shifted in the opposite direction. As economic interests have led to the unfortunate deforestation of parts of the Amazon, and thus increased human exploration and access, researchers began finding unusually nutrient-dense patches of soil and areas with suspiciously high concentrations of normally domestic plants growing in the wild, which led to previous conclusions being revisited. In the 70s, these large, unnatural-looking mounds or hill-like areas of the forest began appearing and revealing substantial evidence of sedentary human habitation. In 2022, Heiko Prumers et al., I hope I pronounced Prumers properly, conducted a series of helicopter flights over sections of the Amazon that his team believed likely to have once contained significant human habitation. Their aircraft was equipped with LiDAR scanners, which essentially allow them to measure the elevation of the rainforest and see past the jungle vegetation using rays of light. Their findings were explosive. Several multi-kilometer-sized settlements were detected beneath the tree lines, containing developed roadways, walls, water management systems, large canals, and what seemed to be monumental palaces within one settlement spanning more than 3 kilometers long. Mind you, this is merely what they found over the course of a single search over an area of just 200 square kilometers. It's very likely that there's way more out there than just this. Thus, thanks to the work of researchers like Prumers, the academic consensus has shifted from dismissing accounts of the Oriana expedition as fantasy to cautiously accepting that he and his men were actually telling the truth. What exactly caused these ancient societies to so rapidly vanish is still up for debate. It's presumed, but far from proven, that smallpox and salmonella outbreaks, similar to those that ravaged post-Columbian Mexico, were the decisive factor, but researchers also suggest changes to the Amazonian climate may have been a factor. The extensive use of reservoirs in several of these settlements suggests, according to Prumers' team, that maybe parts of the Amazon weren't always so wet, and that flooding could have been a part of the story. Whatever the case, I think it's safe to say that the next couple of decades are going to bring a lot of interesting stuff out of the Amazon. As LiDAR develops, and unfortunately more of it is deforested and explored, we're probably going to find several more sites of similar or even greater magnitude. And I'm especially curious if some of the rainforest's current nomadic tribes may be a legacy of these once sedentary societies. You know, perhaps these uncontacted tribes we always talk about out in the Amazon didn't always live like this. Maybe this is a relatively recent transition in their history. Suffice to say, the mystery of lost Amazonian civilizations is one of the biggest of our time, and it's slowly going to get a lot less mysterious over the next few decades. For our 4th spot. Alright, so this next one is probably one of my favorite things to talk about ever, and I think you'll like it. American substances in Egyptian mummies. So, our story begins in 1992, when a team of German toxicologists, led by Svetlana Balbanova, decided to examine multiple hair samples from 9 different Egyptian mummies, who were originally buried in the Deir el-Bahari necropolis in Egypt sometime around 1000 BC, but had since found their way into the private collection of the Bavarian royal family. What the researchers discovered would turn out to be metaphorical dynamite. Indeed, all 9 mummies tested positive for tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, and cocaine. 8 of the 9 also had hair that tested positive for nicotine. The problem here is that nicotine and cocaine are products of the tobacco and coca plants, respectively, which, as many of you may know, are American plants that did not reach the Old World until after Christopher Columbus's voyage. So how on earth are Egyptian mummies testing positive for them? Is this evidence of pre-Columbian contact between the two worlds? Well, as you might imagine, these results ignited a firestorm in the academic community. This isn't supposed to be possible, and a legion of scholars raced to produce an explanation for these findings that didn't require some sort of pre-Columbian exchange. The most obvious potential explanation would be that the mummies could have been exposed to these substances after their mummification. As one German archaeologist noted in a response to Balbanova's work, published in the German edition of Nature, tobacco actually functions as a remarkably effective natural pesticide. In fact, it's the nicotine content of tobacco that repulses and poisons pests. So, from the 1700s up until the early 20th century, it was actually common practice for mummies being kept in museums and private collections to be sprinkled with powdered tobacco as a preservative. And it's possible that some of the mummies could have absorbed traceable amounts of nicotine through their skin as a consequence. Alternatively, cigarette smoke could have been absorbed by the bodies while they were on display or undergoing examination by academics during their possession by the Bavarian royal house. Still, though, this doesn't at all explain the presence of cocaine, which has never been used to treat mummies and would be very difficult for them to come into contact with post-mummification. Another argument was that maybe some sort of still unknown chemical process could have occurred during the mummy's entombment that created signals which just highly resembled nicotine and cocaine compounds. Problem is, this has literally never happened before, and researchers are unable to explain or test this hypothesis, so it seems even more unlikely. Furthermore, in 1995, Balbanova's results were kinda replicated by accident, when Andres Nerlich and his team were examining the mummified remains of a 30 to 40-ish year old Egyptian who lived sometime around 950 BC, and seems to have died of a pulmonary hemorrhage, basically lung bleeding. Nerlich's team found that several of their mummy's organs tested positive for significant quantities of, you guessed it, cocaine, nicotine, and THC. The largest amounts of detectable cocaine and nicotine were found in their subjects' stomach, liver, and intestines, a pattern highly suggestive of oral consumption, and it's very unlikely that such results could have been the product of insecticide treatment or secondhand smoke contamination. If that were the case, you would see the largest quantities in their skin, with very little in their digestive tract. Also, as one might expect, the THC content was found mostly in the man's lungs. Nerlich's team suggests that because this mummy seems to have died of a pulmonary hemorrhage, he very likely spent his final days and weeks in considerable agony, and thus may have been given these substances as a sort of therapy for the pain. Something that I don't think any of the researchers have pointed out, but is my own suspicion, is that the presence of THC in these mummies, which, again, isn't a surprise. We know that ancient peoples in the Near East and Egypt were using THC before. That's not a big bombshell at all. But to me, the presence of their content in these specific mummies is sort of evidence for a sort of culture of substance use, right? I mean, in modern times, it's well understood that people who consume THC or even alcohol are much more likely to mess around with tobacco and cocaine. It seems to me that the THC content almost makes those results more likely and more believable in this context. Still though, as for how these mummies got a hold of tobacco and coca, that's the big mystery, right? I mean, on one hand, I suppose it's possible, though very unlikely, that there was an existing trade route between the Americas and Egypt that allowed this to flourish. Or maybe there was a trade route even before the time of these mummies, like maybe 4, 5, 6,000 BC, that allowed these cultures to get access to tobacco and cocoa plants and grow their own harvests. And eventually that trade route was severed, but they continued growing their own harvests. And then sometime between 1000 BC and today, the Egyptian cocoa and tobacco stock died off. But that too is very unlikely because we don't have any evidence of such cultivation in Egypt, and it's per my understanding that these mummies, these Egyptian mummies, are only examples of this. You know, if there was such a trade route, you would expect to find nicotine and coca in entombed corpses across the Near East. Or would you? Because then again, you have to consider Egypt was really the only culture practicing mummification to this scale. In other civilizations, they just burned or buried their dead and left them to rot. It does kind of make sense finding these substances in Egyptian mummies, because they're the only one you can really do toxicology on in any modern sense. They're the only ones that have been preserved. So overall, gigantic mystery. We have no idea what's going on, and as you might imagine, I think it earned its spot in this iceberg. And finally, last on our list, what happened to Mansa Musa's predecessor? Alright, so chances are if you clicked on this video, you're already at least a little familiar with Mansa Musa. He was the famous king, or Mansa, of West Africa's Mali Empire in the early 1300s. Mansa Musa is most famous for his enormous wealth. As ruler of Mali, he was the personal custodian of what were likely the largest gold reserves of his day, and he wasn't frivolous in his spending. And he pushed hard to elevate Mali's status in the broader Muslim world, spending generously to import scholars, poets, and architects to transform his civilization into a cultural, as well as economic, powerhouse. His most famous feat in particular, and the reason he's featured in most school curriculums, was his famous Hajj, or pilgrimage to Mecca, made between 1324 and 1325. When he and his entourage, said to be 60,000 men strong, made the 2,700-mile journey from Mali to the Islamic holy city of Mecca. And along the way, it's said that he and his group, which would have looked more like a massive army, spent and gave away so much gold in the cities they passed through that the value of gold in these regions would end up being seriously destabilized for several years to come. He's also believed to have ordered the construction of several dozen mosques and public works as a symbol of his piety. Anyway, he eventually returns from his Hajj, builds a bunch of universities and mosques in Mali, went to war over the city of Timbuktu, and passes away sometime in the early 1330s, and the throne moves down to his first son. Now, the real reason I bring all of this up, the big historical mystery behind Mansa Musa, is how exactly he came to power, and more specifically, what happened to his predecessor. You see, according to the Arab historian Ibn al-Umari, who visited Cairo shortly after Mansa Musa's Great Hajj, and conducted a series of interviews with people who claimed to have met the king, Mansa Musa was never originally expected to take the throne at all. Evidently, his predecessor, possibly a man named Mansa Muhammad ibn Q, was obsessed with the ocean, and convinced that something lay on the other side of the Atlantic. So in around the year 1311, Muhammad ibn Q commissioned a massive fleet and set sail to cross the sea, leaving his nephew Musa temporarily in charge of the kingdom to govern until he got back. Alas, the king and his fleet were never heard from again, and when it became clear that they weren't ever coming back, Musa was formally elevated to the throne permanently. In his writings, al-Umari claims to have met with a Mamluk official who spent several days in Mansa Musa's company, and according to that Mamluk official, Musa said the following, quote, "We belong to a house which hands on the kingship by inheritance. The king, who was my predecessor, did not believe that it was impossible to discover the furthest limits of the Atlantic, and wished vehemently to do so. So he equipped 200 ships filled with men, and the same number equipped with gold, water, and provisions enough to last them for years, and said to the man deputed to lead them, 'Do not return until you reach the end of it, or your provisions and water give out.' They departed, and a long time passed before anyone came back. Then one ship returned, and we asked the captain what news they brought. He said, 'Yes, O Sultan, we traveled for a long time until there appeared in the open seas, as it were, a river filled with a powerful current. Mine was the last of those ships. The other ships went on ahead, but when they reached that place, they did not return, and no more was seen of them, and we do not know what became of them. As for me, I went about it at once and did not enter that river. But the Sultan disbelieved him. Then that Sultan got ready 2,000 ships, 1,000 for himself and the men he took, and 1,000 more for water and provisions. He left me deputized to rule the kingdom for him, and embarked on the Atlantic Ocean with his men. That was the last we ever saw of him, or all those with him. And so I then became king in my own right." Now, as absolutely incredible as this story is, we have to keep in mind that our only source for it is an Arab historian who interviewed a guy who claims to have met Mansa Musa a few years ago. It's like 3 layers deep into the telephone game 700 years ago. So, this story should be approached with tremendous caution. Furthermore, a fleet of 200 ships, certainly 2,000, almost has to be an exaggeration. The logistics for something like that would be unimaginable by today's standards. Nonetheless, this is our only existing explanation behind the rise of Mansa Musa. No other sources contradict this account, but they don't mention it either. It's also entirely possible, perhaps even likely, that Mansa Musa just deposed his predecessor violently, and then made up this story as an excuse when asked about what happened. Like, haha, oh yeah, the old king, he's sailing! Yeah, he's sailing right now, I totally didn't lead a palace coup. You get the idea. Still, whatever happened, whether Mansa Musa's predecessor did vanish out at sea, or if he just met a more mundane fate, his fate is still quite a big mystery. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to wrap up. There you have it, 5 mysteries or theories from real-world history that I have decided have not been talked about nearly as enough as they should be. Now, if you're a longtime subscriber to the channel or fan, you're probably wondering, you know what the hell I'm doing talking about history rather than Skyrim or Fallout. And the explanation to that question, the answer, is that right now we're currently working on a really big Fallout video. Not necessarily big in length, it's gonna be about average for this channel standards, you know, hour and a half, maybe around an hour 45. But we're putting a lot of work into the editing and the audio quality, and we're doing some, in my opinion, I think we're making some interesting innovations with how we get our footage. And that project is taking a little bit longer than I would like it to take. You know, normally what I like to do is get a video out, an hour-plus long video every month. And you know, as you can tell, it's been a month since our last video, and that one's still gonna need another week or two in the cooker. So, I figured, well, you know, if that video is going to take so long, why not then go ahead and publish the side project I've been working on? Something you may not know about me is since I was like, you know, a 10-year-old boy, I have really loved diving into and reading giant history books in my free time. It's probably one of my biggest hobbies, and over the last few years, whenever I'm reading a book, I have this notepad file on my phone. And whenever I come across a detail in a text or something that I think is really interesting or obscure, especially a mystery or theory that I hadn't heard about before, I'd always write that down in that notepad. And about 7 or 8 months ago, back in November of 2023, I started kind of just compiling all those facts into a video, largely just for fun. I'm not sure if I ever really intended to upload it. I just thought it was kind of just something to keep me busy, something to do, keep the mind fresh. And I've had this video saved on my computer for a while, and I decided, why not publish it now? And of course, you know, I made a few revisions before I published it. We spiced it up, you know, polished it a bit, but yeah, that's what this is. Again, Fallout content will resume very soon. Our next video will be Fallout-based, then after that we'll do Elder Scrolls. I am not abandoning Bethesda to become a history YouTuber or anything, but if this video does happen to do well, there are many more details on that little notepad that I would love to talk about sometime in the future as a little treat. But anyway, yeah, that's the whole explanation of how this video came to be, its conception and everything. Just wanted to put that out there so no one's too worried. But yeah, thanks so much for stopping by, guys. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope to catch you all in my next video. Peace out, everyone.